So, I got something super cool for you today. Well, not cool exactly. More like, incredibly disturbing, but important to discuss on Doors today.
Oh, what are we diving into this time?
Today we're going to be talking about, and I've been researching this like crazy, the case of Junko Furuta. It's, one of those stories that just completely shakes you to your core.
I've heard bits and pieces about this case, but refresh my memory. This happened in Japan, right?
Yeah, exactly. It took place in 1988 in Japan, and it's honestly one of the most horrific crimes I've ever come across. Like, seriously, it's known as the concrete encased high school girl murder case for reasons that will become tragically clear.
That sounds absolutely terrifying. Before we jump in, should we give our listeners a heads up about the content?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think we really need to warn everyone listening that this episode contains, you know, extremely disturbing details of violence and torture. This is not this is not an easy story to hear, right? If you're sensitive to that kind of material, you might want to skip this one, honestly.
I think that's fair. We try to be respectful with how we present these cases on Doors, but sometimes the truth is just, well, it's horrifying.
It really is. And this particular case, it shocked Japan to its core. It's one of those crimes that changed how an entire country viewed juvenile offenders and the justice system as a whole. So, while it's tough to hear, I think it's important to understand what happened to Junko.
So, Crystal, who exactly was Junko Furuta? Like, before all of this happened to her?
So, Junko she was just a normal 16-year-old high school student, living in Misato, which is like this quiet suburb of Tokyo. And she was known for being really beautiful, like exceptionally pretty, but also super smart. She was doing really well in school, and everyone talked about how kind she was, right? Just a genuinely good person.
Sounds like she had a bright future ahead of her.
Oh, totally, totally. She was actually working part-time at this plastic molding factory while still keeping up her grades. Her teachers loved her, and she was, really well liked by everyone. No enemies, no troubles, just a hardworking kid with dreams.
What about her family life?
From everything I've read, she came from a pretty normal, stable family. Middle-class, caring parents who were, really supportive of her. She lived with them in their home, and they had this completely ordinary life together. Nothing that would ever suggest that something so horrific could happen. You know what I mean?
So, she was literally just a regular teenager going about her day when this happened?
Exactly. That's what makes this so terrifying in a way. Like, on November 25th, 1988, she was just riding her bike home from school like she probably did every single day. She'd been at her part-time job and she was heading home, thinking about homework or friends or whatever normal teens think about.
Did she have any connection to the boys who abducted her?
That's the thing. She didn't really know them at all. She had actually turned down a date with one of them previously, which might have been part of the motivation. But there was no real relationship there. She was just a girl who had rejected a boy's advances, something that happens literally thousands of times every day around the world, right? And for that ordinary decision, she ended up living through absolute hell.
That's chilling. So there was nothing exceptional about her circumstances. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous.
No, not at all. She was, the definition of an innocent victim. Good student, loved by her family, responsible enough to hold down a job while in high school, just a normal girl with normal dreams for her future. And that normalcy is part of what made this case so shocking to Japan. It really seemed like this could have happened to anyone's daughter.
So can you walk me through exactly what happened on that day? Like, how did this abduction actually take place?
So, November 25th, 1988, Junko was riding her bike home, right? And this is something she did every day after her shift at the factory. It was, completely routine for her. She's pedaling along in Misato, this quiet Tokyo suburb, probably thinking about, normal teenage stuff, homework, maybe what's for dinner.
Just a regular day.
Totally regular. And then out of nowhere, these teenage boys, 4 of them, They basically ambush her. One of them, Hiroshi Miyano, he's like the leader of this group. He literally knocks her off her bicycle. Just straight up knocks her down on the street.
That's terrifying. Was it planned? Or was it some kind of random attack?
Oh, it was definitely planned. Miyano actually knew who she was because, like I mentioned before, she had rejected him when he asked her out. And he was this guy who was known to have connections to the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, and he used that to intimidate people. But Junko, she didn't know about his connections when she turned him down. And honestly, even if she had known, a girl has every right to say no, right?
Of course she does.
Exactly. So anyway, they knock her off her bike and they threatened her. They told her they knew where she lived and that they would hurt her family if she didn't go with them. And Junko, being just a regular teenage girl faced with 4 aggressive boys, she went with them. She probably thought, maybe they'd rob her or something and let her go.
So she didn't try to run or scream?
The threat against her family was really effective. These guys, they were intimidating and they made her feel like her family would be in serious danger if she didn't cooperate. So she went along, probably hoping to protect her parents and thinking this would be over quickly.
Where did they take her?
They took her to a house in the Ayase district of Tokyo. It belonged to the parents of one of the boys, Nobuharu Minato. His parents were, get this, almost never home. They were basically living at a separate residence because of the father's job, leaving their teenage son alone in this house for extended periods.
And no one noticed a girl being brought there against her will?
That's one of the most disturbing parts of this whole thing. They walked her through neighborhoods, past people, and nobody noticed anything was wrong. Or if they did notice, they didn't intervene. From the outside, it might have just looked like a group of teenagers walking together,
So that was the beginning of the 44 days.
Yeah, that moment when she stepped into that house, that was the beginning of what can only be described as 44 days of absolute hell. From that point on, she was never free again. And the really heartbreaking thing is that her parents reported her missing right away. They were looking for her the entire time she was being held captive, just a few miles from their home.
So, what exactly makes this case known as the concrete-encased high school girl murder case? That sounds, really specific and, honestly, pretty disturbing.
Well, it's actually exactly what it sounds like, and it's, why this case became so notorious throughout Japan. After they tortured and eventually killed Junko, these boys needed to dispose of her body. And what they did was they mixed her body in concrete inside a metal drum. Like, they literally encased her in concrete and then abandoned the drum in a cement factory in Koto, Tokyo.
Oh my God, that's horrifying.
It really, really is. And the thing is, when workers eventually discovered this drum, this concrete-filled drum on January 23rd, 1989, that's when the case blew wide open. The police had to literally chip away at this concrete to reveal Junko's body inside. It was this shocking visual, this concrete tomb that became emblematic of the whole case.
What state was her body in when they found her?
Honestly, it's really hard to talk about. The autopsy revealed that Junko had been beaten so severely that her face was unrecognizable. Her body was covered in cigarette burns, literally hundreds of them. She had multiple bone fractures. The medical examiner determined that the repeated trauma she endured would have caused immense suffering before her death.
That's just, I don't even have words.
Yeah, and the public reaction was just complete shock, This case received massive media coverage in Japan. It was unlike anything they had seen before. The brutality, the length of time she was held, the ages of the perpetrators, everything about it was horrifying.
Did people know she was missing during those 44 days?
Absolutely. That's what makes this even more tragic. Her face was on missing person posters everywhere. Her parents were desperately searching for her. The police had an active investigation going. But here's the shocking part. One of the perpetrators actually called Junko's mother at one point and taunted her, saying her daughter was never coming home.
What? That's beyond cruel.
It gets worse. During her captivity, the boys would sometimes force Junko to call her parents and tell them she had run away and was safe, just to keep them from searching too hard. Can you imagine that psychological torture for both Junko and her parents?
How did the case affect Japan as a whole?
Oh, it completely shook Japanese society to its core. Like, this wasn't just another crime story. It fundamentally changed how Japan viewed juvenile crime, trust in communities, everything. People couldn't believe that something this horrific could happen in their safe, orderly society. And the fact that these were ordinary teenage boys, not hardened criminals, that terrified parents across the country.
So what was, the cultural context in Japan at that time? I mean, was this kind of juvenile crime common? Or was this case a real outlier?
You know, that's such an important question. Japan in the late 1980s was actually considered one of the safest countries in the world. Like, violent crime rates were incredibly low, and there was this really strong sense of community and social order. People left their doors unlocked, kids walked to school alone, that kind of thing.
Then, how did something this horrific even happen there?
Well, that's exactly why it was so shocking, right? It completely shattered this national self-image of Japan as this haven of safety and order. And the thing is, while juvenile delinquency existed, it was usually, minor stuff. Shoplifting, vandalism, maybe some bullying, but nothing like this level of sadistic violence.
What about the legal system? How did Japan handle juvenile crime before this case?
So Japan had, and still has, this juvenile law system that's really, really focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Especially back then, juveniles under 20 were treated with a sort of protective approach. The idea was to reform them, not just lock them away. Their identities were protected, their records sealed. There was this whole philosophy that young offenders could be rehabilitated and reintegrated into society.
That sounds good in theory, but...
Exactly. Like, in theory, great. But Junko's case made people question everything about that system. Because here you had these teenage boys committing literally unspeakable acts, and many Japanese citizens started wondering if their juvenile justice system was just too lenient. Was it actually equipped to handle monsters, not just wayward teens?
Did this case change how the media covered juvenile crime?
Oh, totally. Before Junko's murder, media coverage of juvenile crime was really, really restricted. But this case was so brutal that it kind of broke through those barriers. Though the killers' names weren't officially released because they were minors, their identities eventually leaked out through weekly magazines and, later, the internet. And it sparked this massive national debate about media ethics, privacy laws, the public's right to know, all of that.
What about regular people? How did they react?
The public reaction was just unprecedented. There were these massive public demonstrations demanding justice for Junko. People were absolutely outraged, and there was this collective soul-searching happening across Japan. Parents started questioning how these boys could turn so violent. Schools began implementing more bullying prevention programs. Communities that once felt inherently safe suddenly felt vulnerable.
So it really transformed Japanese society on multiple levels.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about this one horrific crime. It became this cultural inflection point that forced Japan to confront some really uncomfortable questions about youth violence, about the justice system, about community responsibility. And, even today, more than 30 years later, Junko's case is still discussed in criminology classes, in legal reform debates. It's become this sort of dark reference point in Japanese cultural memory.
So, what happened to these boys after they were caught? I mean, they must have received some really harsh sentences, right?
Well, that's where this case gets even more disturbing, if you can believe it. Because of Japan's juvenile protection laws at that time, the sentences were shockingly lenient given the brutality of their crimes.
Wait, seriously? How lenient are we talking about?
So the ringleader, who was considered the most culpable in orchestrating the whole thing, received only 20 years in prison. And the others got sentences ranging from just 5 to 10 years. Like, we're talking about 44 days of unspeakable torture that led to a young girl's death. And and the harshest sentence was 20 years.
That's absolutely mind-blowing. How could that possibly happen?
It comes down to several factors. First, they were all under 18, which meant they were protected by Japan's juvenile law. This law was really designed to, give young offenders a chance at rehabilitation rather than punishment. But in this case, it meant that even though they committed horrific adult crimes, they received juvenile sentences.
Couldn't the prosecutors do anything about that? I mean, surely there must have been some way to make an exception for such an extreme case.
The prosecutors actually tried. They really did. They pushed for the maximum penalties possible. But the legal framework just didn't allow for the kind of sentences many felt these crimes deserved. And to make matters worse, their identities were protected because they were minors. So while the case was hugely publicized, their names were officially withheld from the public.
So they could potentially just re-enter society and no one would know what they did?
Exactly, and that's what many people found so terrifying. Though I should mention that through magazine reports and later through internet forums, their identities eventually became widely known. But legally speaking, yeah, they were protected.
Did the families of the perpetrators face any consequences?
The parents of the house where Junko was held captive actually paid a civil settlement to her family. But beyond that, the focus of the legal system remained primarily on the boys themselves. One really disturbing aspect is that the parents of the boy whose house it happened in were reportedly home during much of Junko's captivity, and they claimed they were too afraid of their son to intervene or call the police.
I don't even have words for that. Was there any public backlash to these sentences?
Oh, absolutely. The public outcry was enormous. There were protests, petitions, demands for legal reform. Many Japanese citizens felt that the justice system had completely failed Junko. And this case actually became a catalyst for discussions about reforming Japan's juvenile law system.
Did those reforms actually happen?
Yes and no. In 2000, about a decade after Junko's case, Japan did revise its juvenile law to allow harsher punishments for serious crimes committed by minors. And then in 2014, they lowered the age at which offenders could be tried as adults from 16 to 14 for certain serious crimes. So her case did eventually lead to some meaningful legal changes, but many argue it was too little, too late.
And what about the perpetrators now? Are they all free?
As far as we know, yes, they've all completed their sentences and been released, and that's something that continues to disturb many people, the idea that these individuals are walking free somewhere in Japan today.
So, beyond the legal changes you just mentioned, how else has Junko's case impacted Japanese society? Like, did it change how people think about violent crime or how the media covers these kinds of stories?
Oh, absolutely. It had a profound impact that's still felt today. Prior to Junko's case, there was this kind of perception in Japan that extreme violent crime, especially among juveniles, was something that happened in other countries, not in Japan. Her case just completely shattered that illusion.
I can imagine that would be really jarring for people.
It really was. And the media coverage changed dramatically afterward. Before this case, Japanese media tended to be more restrained in reporting violent crimes. But Junko's murder just sparked this massive shift. It became this watershed moment where the brutality couldn't be glossed over, The newspapers and TV started covering violent crime in much more detail, especially when it involved young people.
Has her story stayed in the public consciousness over the years?
God, yes. Junko Furuta's name is still instantly recognizable to most Japanese people. Her case is regularly referenced in discussions about juvenile crime, about bullying, about, the failure of adults to intervene when something is clearly wrong. There have been books, documentaries, even films inspired by her story. It's become this cultural touchstone for talking about the darkest potential of human behavior.
That's something, at least, that she's not forgotten.
Right, and there's this memorial to her at the cemetery where she's buried. People still visit it, leave flowers, students especially. It's become this place where people go to reflect on, the consequences of standing by when others are suffering. Because, one of the most disturbing aspects of this whole case was how many people knew something was happening but did nothing.
What lessons do you think society has actually learned from this tragedy? Has anything really changed?
That's a complicated question. I think there have been some concrete changes like the legal reforms we talked about, but on a deeper level, Junko's case forced Japanese society to confront some really uncomfortable truths about juvenile violence, about the failure of authority figures, about this culture of silence that can exist when people are afraid to speak up.
Do you think a case like this could happen again?
I want to say no, but the honest answer is that it could. What this case did was make people more vigilant, more willing to report suspicious behavior. Teachers, neighbors, police, they're all more attuned to warning signs now. And the juvenile justice system has more teeth. But preventing something like this ultimately depends on addressing the root causes of such extreme violence and cruelty.
Which are?
Well, things like, the normalization of violence, inadequate intervention in early delinquent behavior, family dysfunction, and importantly, creating a society where bystanders feel empowered to speak up rather than look the other way. That's probably the biggest lesson from Junko's case. The danger of silence and inaction in the face of evil.
I think that's the hardest part for me to wrap my head around. The silence. How could so many people have known something and just done nothing?
Yeah, it's truly devastating to think about. And I think that's why Junko's story is so important to keep telling, because it reminds us that evil thrives when good people look away. There were so many moments where her suffering could have been stopped if just one person had taken action.
It makes you wonder what you would do in that situation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's why this case continues to haunt people, because it forces us to confront this really uncomfortable question about our own moral courage. Would we speak up? Would we intervene? Or would we, convince ourselves it wasn't our problem?
God, this whole story is it's just heartbreaking on so many levels.
It really is. But I think by remembering Junko, by talking about what happened to her, we're doing something important. We're keeping her memory alive, and we're reminding ourselves and our listeners that we all have a responsibility to look out for each other, especially the vulnerable among us.
You're right. And I hope that anyone listening who sees something concerning in their own lives feels empowered to speak up.
That would be the greatest tribute to Junko's memory, honestly. If her story prevents even one person from suffering or inspires someone to intervene when they see something wrong, that's powerful.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Doors. I want to thank everyone for listening to this difficult but important story.
Yeah, thank you all. And just a quick preview. Next week, we'll be exploring the fascinating case of the Dyatlov Pass incident, where 9 Russian hikers mysteriously died in the Ural Mountains under really bizarre circumstances.
Oh, that one's been on my list forever. I can't wait to dig into it with you.
It's a wild one for sure. So until next week, this has been Doors, the podcast that opens up the most intriguing stories from history.
Take care of yourselves and each other.